welcome back to the show. I'm here with Ray Camden, and he is the developer advocate for IBM, and he does an amazing amount of stuff. He works on loopback, API Connect, serverless, hybrid, mobile development, HTML5, web standards, and Node.js, which is what we're here to talk about today. And fortunately, Ray has his army of stormtroopers with him in the room, just in case there are any difficult questions that have to be handled. I take it you're a great fan of Star Wars. I think I've known that for a long time.
Just a little bit.
Just a little. So in today's episode, Node.js for CFers, we're going to look at what Node.js really is, why you should be programming in it, and what the hardest thing for a CFer learning Node is. And we'll also look at deployment tips, how you can test your Node app, and also Ray is going to be talking on the subject at CFObjective, so we'll be looking at that as well. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So for those few people who've been isolated in the universe and don't know what Node.js is, what exactly is it?
So the super simple way of thinking about it is being able to write JavaScript on the server. So take in the JavaScript that you normally would only use in the browser to do front-end interactivity, but actually being able to use it to write your back-end code. So for many, many years, I did ColdFusion on the server, outputting HTML, but also making it work with JavaScript on the front end. So again, it's extremely simplistic way to think about it, but that's one way of thinking about it. It's also a pretty different way to build your backend applications as well. So one of the issues I had was thinking about it just as JavaScript on the server. And I immediately kind of ran into, I would do this so-and-so way in ColdFusion to do a contact form, for example. And it wasn't that direct in Node.js. Wasn't that it was harder, just that I had to think about it in a different way from my typical ColdFusion development. And that's really kind of what I'm focusing on at my presentation at CFObjective, is those kind of mental, not hurdles per se, but different ways of thinking about building your apps in terms of working with Node.js versus ColdFusion. And one of the things I want to do is like cover like a soup to nuts in terms of, when I was doing this in ColdFusion, this is how I would start just to test something. When I was building an app, this is what I would do. When I was working with sessions, when I was working with forms, all these kind of very typical things in ColdFusion. They're all pretty easy in Node.js. They're just different. And knowing how to approach that. And again, very much based on this is how I did things in CF, this is how I do it in Node. That's going to be the core of my talk. I only have an hour, so I definitely can't get super deep. But again, that's why I'm focusing on all those things that kind of tripped me up that I wish people had told me when I was learning Node. That was a very long answer. Sorry.
No, long answers are good on this show. Technical detail is what gets people excited. So Node.js is basically a JavaScript framework. And I guess, is that true? Or are you giving me...
I wouldn't call it framework since that's a very overloaded term. It's JavaScript on the server, which again is not the best way of saying it, but I wouldn't say framework. It's not like, Model Glue or, Framework One. It's essentially a JavaScript engine that's running on your server that allows it to run JavaScript code on the server. And it's highly optimized. It's really fast. It can do a lot more than JavaScript in the client. So, you have file read-write access and, low-level binary type stuff that honestly I never touch. But yes, not a framework.
Okay, an engine, not a framework. And it's running on the server, unlike most JavaScript, which runs on the client.
Yeah.
So here's the $64,000 question. Why would someone want to program in Node?
So I do a lot of front-end development anyway. So being able to use the same language in both sides, I guess, even though it's a totally different context per se, I'm not having to think about how to write an if condition or how to do so and so. I know the syntax. I may be doing things differently, but I know the syntax of JavaScript. So to me, that's a big advantage. One of the other things that I really like about Node is that typically what you're creating has a much smaller footprint than ColdFusion. I know Lucy is a lot more lightweight, or that's my impression, than Adobe ColdFusion. But Node can be even smaller, very, very small footprint. So I like that I could write something and get something up and running and being able to put it on a server with very minimal resources.
So you could deploy it on a DigitalOcean droplet and it would run just fine.
You can deploy there. There's 1,000 places to put it up. IBM, we have Bluemix. That's our commercial offering. Certainly, there's a bunch more out there. I was just looking at now by Zeit, and I'm probably saying their name wrong, but they also have a simple command line to put Node.js apps up. There's a lot of options out there. I would say it's probably a lot more than ColdFusion. So where you can deploy stuff is greater. And also I think another reason to learn Node is I think the market's going to be significantly bigger for that. And to be clear, I'm not positioning my talk as you should stop using CF and CF is bad and all that. My assumption is that you want to learn Node, not, just to expand your own skills. So it's not about, bashing CF at all. But I do think you're, in terms of where you could put your code and certainly the amount of people that you can interact with, there's going to be a larger audience as well.
Okay. So if you're a CFer and you want to learn Node, what's the hardest thing?
So, and I kind of want to say attend my session, but I'll speak in general. So I've had ColdFusion installed and tied to Apache for probably near 20 years. And in that model, you can just drop the CFM into the web server. And if ColdFusion 13 added the foo function, I could put a CFM in there and say CF output foo, close CF output, and then just run that in my browser. And I could see, oh, that's how this function worked. In terms of doing that with Node, it is still pretty easy, but I went into the context of thinking I need to build a web server every time. And I don't like building web servers because I never did with ColdFusion. So that was totally my mistake, my kind of, I did this in CF, I got to do it in Node as well. So one of the things I'll talk about is, the difference between running a Node script to test one particular function, which I think is a valid use case while you're learning, versus building an application or building an API. There's definitely a difference in how you approach that. And I really wish I had known that on day one.
Mm. And you can put this on any OS, Windows, Mac, Linux.
Yeah, so I'm on Windows now, but I'm using the Ubuntu Bash shell on Windows. So that's about as hybrid as you can get, probably.
Hmm. And I'm assuming you can even run it in a container like Docker if you really wanted to.
Yeah, I don't use Docker. I know all the cool kids do, but I don't. Also, because I don't do a lot of production work. I do a lot of demos and stuff like that. So, my use case is more a lot of small, quick demos to illustrate something or to do something for a blog or a presentation versus, a project that I'm going to work on for 6 months and then deploy and work with others. So in that regards, I'm a bit different. I will definitely try to touch on that in my presentation to make people aware of that.
And I'm assuming there's no cost to using Node.js. It's open source, right?
Free and open source, yeah.
All right, cool. So if you've got your Node app and you've figured out and you've attended your talk and translated stuff from ColdFusion paradigms to Node paradigms, now you want to deploy it Is that easy or?
Yeah. I mean, so again, this is something where in the ColdFusion mindset, at least for me, it was in the older days, call up the host and say, I want foo.com, and they would send you an email with, here's your login. That would RDP in, go on the Windows box, install CF, install Apache, and do all that. And that was relatively easy. With AWS, that can be a little bit easier. I know you can do images with AWS as well. So I would say it's even easier with Node. Again, I work for a company that has an environment for that. And there's other environments as well that for like a lot of use cases from my command line, I can just say, push this up. And then a minute later, depending on how big the site is, that the whole thing is updated.
Wow, that sounds really efficient.
Yes.
So, and sounds pretty similar to, I guess, what Command Box does with ColdFusion apps these days.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a bit behind in terms of deploying CF apps because I haven't deployed a CF app in a while. I have used the Command Box and Box Server, and that's freaking awesome. That almost makes me wish I was doing CF more. I still do ColdFusion for clients, typically small things like, hey, make this API work for me. And the first time I just went to a folder, put a CFM and did box server start, and it grabbed all the bits and just ran. I freaking fell in love. I thought it was awesome.
It is pretty amazing. And I must admit, I grew up with a command line instead of all this point and click stuff. So there's some things that are easier to do in a command line.
Yeah.
So you've got your Node app. How would you go about testing it? Is it same kind of tools as used for a ColdFusion app? Or no?
The same type of concept. So I know ColdFusion has testing frameworks where you write unit tests, and there's multiple versions of that for JavaScript that work both client side and server side code. So same concept. You write a unit test. You focus your test on one particular function or one part of your application, and you can make that part of your build process. You can put into your tool chain completely or run them ad hoc, however particular you want to be with testing. You can definitely do that with Node.js.
Okay, cool. So is it easy to track down bugs in it, or is it, because I know whenever I've worked with JavaScript, it was a pain in the rear end, but
I would say yes and no. You definitely get stack traces when you have an error, and the stack trace, I would say, is a bit friendlier than a Java stack trace. So I don't think it's hard to recognize an error when you see it. The one thing I definitely miss is the ColdFusion debugging output. There's definitely Node.js versions of performance tuning and stuff like that. I find it typically to be really, really hard, really, really obtuse. Whereas I think CF's debug stuff was incredibly simple and very direct for a given request. 40% was spent on a DB call, and it was this query, and it was super slow. Or you may have two queries on a page, and you can immediately see that one's running real slow. So all that type of stuff you can definitely do in Node.js, and IBM has some open source projects involved in that. But you definitely have to do a bit of work to get that in there, as opposed to CF, where it's just bam. I never did the hardcore server tuning like Charlie Earhart and Mike Brunt did. Most of my server tuning was turning on the debugging and just pouring over that. And I would say one thing that ColdFusion really wins at is just how useful that was. Because at least for me, I would say 80% of the time, that was enough for me to find the problem. And then the other 20%, I said, okay, I give up, go talk to Charlie.
Well, I don't know if you know this, but Gert Franz is giving a talk on custom CF debuggers at CFObjective. So he and I just talked. And
I saw that. I actually built a couple of those custom debuggers years and years ago.
Oh, wow.
Adobe would pick some of those up. I don't think they ever did. But yeah, 8 years ago, I remember looking at the template, and it was unencrypted. And I was surprised because most of the CF admin stuff is encrypted. And I know I built a couple. I saw some other people built some as well. Even simple stuff like greater highlighting of issues to make them stand out a bit more. That was all hackable for years and years. So I'm happy to see it getting some attention.
Yeah. I mean, you can write your own debugging template and do all kinds of custom things. So pretty amazing stuff. And then any other advice on, is there like a mindset shift you have to go through to do Node.js? I mean, the syntax of JavaScript sounds pretty straightforward, but.
Yeah. So yeah. And, again, it kind of goes back to like, how do I test one thing in Node versus how do I build an application in Node? And again, I'll be talking about that. There's frameworks that make building apps super easy. Express is probably the most well-known one. That's what got me into Node, because before Express, it looked like too much work. So there's stuff like that makes it easier. And again, I'll be talking about that in the presentation.
And then is Node something you can have thousands of users hitting the server on, or is it only a few who can hit it? Or
it's definitely highly performant. That's one of its selling points. I honestly haven't pushed it hard myself, so I can't say I have an app that has so many million users or whatever. But because it's so slimmed down, it's not loading up, for example, a CF PDF engine to do. Although to be fair, I know ColdFusion laser loads that stuff nowadays, which is good. But in the old days, it was loading everything, CF chart, all that. But Node pretty much loads only the one or two things it needs to do. So my application is extremely slimmed down.
So that sounds similar in concept to all the kind of stuff that we were talking about at Into the Box, where they had that micro services architecture where you only load the bits that you're using. So it's kind of cool that you're doing that in Node.js as well.
And what's nice about it, so I mean, if you have, if what you're offering is made up of 5 parts and you've broken that into 5 microservices or 5 separate servers, if one of those is like super critical and just needs more juice, and a lot of hosting providers for Node.js, you literally just go in there and bump the CPU up, bump the RAM up, give that one thing what it needs, and the other 4 can just stay, piddly small if they need to.
Wow. So that gives you better performance without having to pay an arm and a leg for much more servers.
Yeah. So typically I would have one CF monolithic server doing everything. And if I could have broken it up into smaller parts and made the slower parts more powerful, I could have saved money. And again, I haven't deployed CF in a couple of years, so that may be something that people are doing now.
So coming back to CF, you did that for a long time. Why were you proud to use it when that was your main thing?
It was very practical, very direct in terms of what you wanted to build. It just plain worked. I can remember when I was learning Groovy, and I got the book on Groovy, and they were talking about some of the impetus for why they were built. They gave the example of reading a file in Java, and it's all this file object, file reader object, file reader buffer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like, yeah, we realize that people like to read files, so we made a shortcut for all that. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's exactly what CF has been doing for a long time as well, making the shortcuts. So I really appreciated how practical it was, and people outside the CF community love to call out all the bad code that was created. And that was never the fault of CF. It was the fault of the person. But, if they were getting stuff done and being productive and being successful, if they use tags instead of script, who cares? I'll probably get thrashed for saying that, but CF allowed people to get things done. So I actually had a great dinner years ago with a guy who was not a developer at all. He was a doctor. and he just raved about how happy he was with ColdFusion because it allowed him to be successful. And his code was not great. It wasn't MVC, it wasn't best standards and all that, but the platform allowed him to be successful. And I think that is something that CF should be proud of. Excuse me.
I would agree with that. Much more productivity, whatever language you use. I think that's important these days. So, what would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year? I mean, some people have been saying it's been dying for 10 years or more. It seems to still be going. So,
I wouldn't even know. Adobe is being successful enough to keep working on the product. So we could comment about their marketing or lack thereof, or their decisions to make like CF Client and all that. But for them, at least, they're making enough money to keep working on it, which I think for a person who makes a product, that's typically what you want. I don't know what the numbers are in terms of developers working on CF. I'm sure Adobe would say it's good. I'd be surprised if they said it was growing. I think it's always going to be a niche product. It's its own language. It's a language that has warts like any other language out there. But I honestly couldn't tell you what it would take to grow significantly. I don't think it ever will. And I don't say that to badmouth CF. I don't see that as happening. I think JavaScript is definitely getting most of the attention. Languages like Go are getting a lot more attention as well. And CF, I don't think, can just magically catch the attention again. They would almost have to rebrand and pick a new name. And I think that was actually talked about at one time.
Well, I guess Lucy is a new name in some sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about Lucy, then I think you may have a chance. But, until I see people talking about it like on Medium or at major conferences outside of CFObjective, more generic web-based industry conferences, I think it just may be one of those small languages that sits on the sidelines and carries on okay, and that may be all it does, and that may be okay.
All right. So you're speaking at CFObjective not only on Node.js, but also on serverless. And we talked about that in a podcast episode a few episodes back. But what are you looking forward to at CFObjective this year?
Mainly being at a conference where I know most of the people. That's quite nice, because a lot of conferences I go to, no one knows me. So it's nice to be where, it's the more general web community and Node.js community is just very large. So I typically know people there, but like no one knows me. So it's nice for a place where I know people and they know me. It's very friendly. I'm also happy to see that it's in Washington. I haven't been there in a decade or more probably. So I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, I understand there have been some changes in Washington. But
yeah, I don't want to talk about that.
We'll keep that silent. Well, great. Well, wonderful talking with you, Ray. If people wanted to reach you, how could they find you on the internet?
Sure. My blog is raymondcamden.com, and my Twitter nick is raymondcamden.
Excellent. And we also can find you, looks like, on GitHub, CF Jedi Master.
Yes.
And did you manage to keep the Jedi Master in your handle for your current position, or? I seem to remember that was a critical negotiating point at one point.
No, for IBM, I just assumed the process to get an email alias would be too much trouble. So no, I have a very boring IBM email address.
All right. Well, great talking to you. Have fun in Louisiana, and hope you have a great time in our nation's capital. Lots of things to see there. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.
No problem.